Whether it is Charlottesville, Virginia, or Barcelona, Spain, many around the world are wondering how to guard against these kind of terror attacks. Jonathan Schanzer is a former counterterrorism analyst for the U.S. Treasury and currently the vice president of research for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And Frank Cilluffo is the director of the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security and a CBS News security consultant. Both join me now. Jonathan, I'll start with you. Europe obviously has seen a number of these types of attacks in recent years. France, Belgium, Germany, London we saw even recently. Spain really, up until now, has been spared. What do you make of this violence now in Spain and Barcelona?
Well, obviously I think the intent here is to attack the West. I think there is an historic grievance that ISIS has when they think about the lost Islamic Caliphate. They think about Spain. But I think more to the point, what we have right now is the dispersal of ISIS from its land-based headquarters in Raqqa in Syria. Right now they're being defeated roundly. We heard at one point that there were as many as 30 or 35,000 fighters in the ISIS army. That number is now down to about 15,000. Now, some of them have, of course, been killed on the battlefield, but many have gone home to the countries where they came from. And so that means that you have potentially hundreds of ISIS fighters right now going back to places like Spain or Belgium or France. And I think we're going to see an uptick of ISIS attacks as they take on the sort of form that we're more accustomed to seeing in a group like al-Qaeda.
So more along the lines of the return of some people than recruitment and radicalization going on in Spain?
Well, I think we've got both. I mean, in other words, for those fighters to have gone to Raqqa, to have gone to fight for the Islamic State, there had to have been a recruiting system. There had to have been people there who are helping to, as people say, to radicalize these individuals. And so those people are still there. You now have the returnees. I think it's sort of a, kind of a perfect storm for a lot of these countries in Europe.
Frank, we heard Ron Hosko in the piece say it's almost impossible to stop some of these types of attacks in regards to these pedestrian thoroughfares. But how can some of the European governments, what can they do differently maybe to help diminish some of these?
You know, I mean, Spain itself actually has a very sophisticated and very robust counterterrorism capability, and it was slow to get up to speed until the attack, the significant attack in 2004 that killed so many. But since then, they've really ramped up their capabilities. But I think Jonathan kind of touched on this, and it's the fact that you can't look at this through a national lens alone. When you start looking at the European foreign fighters, when you start looking at Europe as a whole, the Schengen Agreement and the lack of borders, the ability for foreign fighters to be able to travel freely throughout Europe. I think all things said and done, it may be overstated, but it is true. Intelligence is the lifeblood for our campaign against terrorism, and we got to continue to ramp up some of those capabilities. I do think the Europeans can do a little more in terms of border control and ensuring that there are no seams across the European web there. And then here's a confrontational one and a little delicate, but the reality is we've got to address the underpinning ideology that fuels the jihadist narrative, and to me that is an area we need to ramp up some of our efforts, and the Europeans do as well.
You know, Frank, you mentioned this idea of seamlessness. It has to translate also to the United States, that type of sharing as well between the intelligence communities.
Absolutely. I mean, the truth is the U.S. has very strong relationships with the Spanish authorities, the British authorities, but as we saw in Belgium, for example, until they witnessed the horrific terrorist attacks that they witnessed recently, their capabilities were not up to par. So what you really need is to ensure that all of Europe is doing all that they can, and the fact that this may be a broader plot or a broader network, if in fact the Spanish authorities said was linked to a big bomb, an IED in terms of the home that blew up. Here we have something that could be more than just an individual who is inspired, but it could be either foreign directed, it could be homegrown, or possibly a hybrid of both, as we saw in France, as we saw in Belgium.
Are there things we can learn from Europe as well, Frank?
Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a transnational threat. It's going to demand transnational solutions. We can't stop at the water's edge. Visa waiver, we have vulnerabilities that we share with Europe. So clearly, we want to learn from the mistakes of others, as awful as that may sound, but we also want to figure out what is actually working, and it's a numbers game in Europe. I mean, they're dealing with big numbers, so it's a very difficult challenge that they're struggling with. And yes, I think we have a lot to learn from the Europeans, and we have a lot we can share with the Europeans to enhance their capabilities.
Jonathan, no matter what it is, it seems like they say follow the money. You were a terror finance analyst for the Treasury. Where are terror groups like ISIS getting funding and supplies?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, for attacks like this, you don't need a lot of money. You know, what you have is essentially a bunch of guys communicating by phone with encrypted apps that they're able to download for free. They need a few $100s to rent a car. They need a driver's license, so they need to be able to at least establish residency. And then beyond that, perhaps go and scope out a target like this to make sure that you don't have barricades, that it's not hardened. And then you can go out and carry out an attack like this. So it doesn't cost a lot of money. ISIS more broadly does bring in a lot of money from taxation from the territory that they control. They've got foreign donors from places like the Persian Gulf. They've been engaged in trading in oil as well as antiquities and just overall kind of illicit financial schemes, money laundering and the like.
Right.
But unfortunately, this really is just a minor financial investment for a major attack.
Yeah, I mean, but if you go back to that idea that if you got rid of the larger group, you may stop whether this was an inspired attack or one that was certainly from them. Is there a way to effectively cut off the revenue streams for ISIS?
Look, what we're doing right now in defeating ISIS, I think, is contributing significantly. I mentioned that most of their money comes from taxation, so if you rob them of the territory, you rob them of the people to bilk, it means that they have less money. The problem is that when these guys return home, they engage in their ongoing jobs, right? I mean, they can get a job doing just about anything, raise money, and use a small amount for an attack like this. And that is what's so dangerous about the returnee problem. We saw it with Al-Qaeda in the early 2000s when they were ejected from the Afghan stronghold under the Taliban, and they came back and they created these affiliate groups and cells and started to carry out attacks around the world. This is exactly what we're seeing now, but I think in much greater number. That's the concern. We
were warned about this, though, also. This isn't coming as a surprise.
No, I mean, ISIS has actually exhorted their adherents to go out and carry out vehicular attacks. This has been a well-known thing for a couple of years, and of course, the tactic itself, as you mentioned, we've seen it all across Europe, but also we've seen it in the Middle East. I mean, Hamas has used it against the Israelis. There's really virtually nothing that can be done about it. It's a well-established tactic, and one that leaves even the most advanced Western societies with very effective intelligence apparatus, it leaves them very helpless.
And if you talk about recruitment when it comes to ISIS, obviously you think of the internet now, a substantial presence there, Frank. How effective is their use of the internet for radicalization?
You know, I mean, I think it's a central front in the battle against ISIS. Obviously, we need to take away their ability to have territory to plan and execute attacks, but we also need to continue to redouble our efforts in cyberspace, because ultimately, if you look at how sophisticated their radicalization efforts have been, quite sophisticated. I mean, if you look back to not so long ago when I was in government, Al-Qaeda was sort of like the Blair Witch Project. If you start looking at ISIS in terms of the quality of their media efforts, it's literally Xbox. It's very sophisticated, and it doesn't need to resonate with a lot of people. It just needs to resonate with a handful of people.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But have we gotten anywhere? Because I feel like we have talked about this time and time again, their ability to recruit by using the internet. Have we cut off one source and they've just found another way around it?
You know, you got two things here. You've got one, their ability to propagate their propaganda, their narrative, their message, their ideology. And you also have how are they using technology for tradecraft purposes to to be able to, the going dark problem as we talk about, the ability to, for law enforcement not to glean insights and do communications or signals intelligence on these perpetrators. So Facebook has amped up some of their efforts and they're doing some good work. YouTube, not as much, but you are starting to see at least the social media companies in the United States recognize that they've got a problem on their hands, and more can be done technically. Anytime you have anything with an ISIS logo, for example, that should automatically be bagged and tagged and identified. So more can be done. There is some effort that's ongoing, but I come back to the fact that we've got to expose the hypocrisy of their ideological message, their narrative.
Easier said than done, it seems like.
Much easier said than done.
Jonathan Schanzer, Frank Cilluffo, thank you so much for the insight.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you.